right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Pensive Politics, Mr. Watson. I'm your host, Christian Watson. And with me today, I have Hannah Cox, who is a prolific conservative libertarian writer who has written a lot of good stuff that I've always enjoyed. I've looked at her stuff quite a bit, and who is also launching a vodcast, which is a video podcast, which she'll tell us about in a moment. But Hannah, how you doing? How you doing?
I'm great. Good to be here. Thanks so much for having me on.
No problem at all. So tell the audience a little bit about you. If they may not know who you are, or you're not familiar with your work, tell them a little bit about you.
Sure. Well, for my full-time work, I am the senior national manager of an organization called Conservatives Concerned About the Death Penalty. And so my day-to-day is very engrossed in criminal justice reform, specifically working around death penalty cases, but also doing a lot of work around trauma-informed responses to violence, violence interruption, and racial equity. Outside of that, I also do write a good bit. I am an insider for Newsmax. I am a contributor to the Washington Examiner, and I write at a few other outlets as well. I call myself a libertarian-conservative. My main topics always revolve around free market issues, limited government, and individual liberty. And so that's kind of what the bulk of my work has been centered on. And as you mentioned, I am in preparation this week of launching a new vodcast called Based. That's going to be a monthly series that digs into the root issues of some of the most pressing topics Americans are concerned about. So I'm really excited about that, excited for a new medium. And before all of that, I was in the music industry. So I've had kind of two careers in my life. I started off in a really different industry, different direction, and stumbled into this. So this is actually my second career, but I'm really passionate about it. And I feel so fortunate to get to be involved in a way that I think makes a difference in people's lives and to fight injustice in this country, and just feel really fortunate to get to do the work.
The music industry, that's a first. I've interviewed a lot of political writers and talkers and candidates and all kind of folks, but nary have I met one that has come from the music industry. That's just very interesting. Tell us about that, because I'm a stickler for music. I love music, absolutely. As anyone who knows me personally will know that I adore music. I mean, I'm constantly singing some tune, whether it's Prince or Elton John. I absolutely adore music. So what brought you into politics and nonprofit
It's random,
advocacy?
right?
Yeah.
I get asked all the time, like, what do I go to school for to do what you do? And I'm like, you don't need to go to school to do what I do. You need to do the work and learn the issues. And that's more important than what your degree is in. But I was like you, I loved music. I was a performer. I did musical theater. I was a songwriter. And I just really, my entire life wanted to move to Nashville and do music. And so when I turned 18, that's what I did. I went to a school in Nashville called Belmont University that's actually right on Music Row. If you look it up, their alumni include everybody from like Brad Paisley to Amy Grant to more recent artists like Florida Georgia Line. They've had a lot of people come out of there. And they're unique because they have a traditional music performance school like you would find at most college campuses, but they also have a music business program where you can go and actually get a BBA, but it just focuses on the music industry. You do a lot of internships. And so it's just a bit more, it felt like a more solid degree to me. I felt like I would learn the ropes a bit more quickly. As an artist, I felt like I would learn how to protect myself from bad contracts or bad deals. And so that's what I did. And that's how I got my foot in the door. So I was at Belmont for 3 years, very involved in the music industry, had a lot of cool internships during that time. And then when I graduated, I worked for Entertainment One, which is a global conglomerate company, for about 5 years, and then moved into politics. So that was kind of how I got into it. And the reasons I got out were I just didn't really like it. I loved performance. I loved singing. I didn't like the business side of the music industry. I really didn't like the day-to-day of what life looked like. And I felt the reasons that I fell in love with music were because I thought music could connect with people, help them understand what they were going through, help them through hard times. That was, the underlying reason I loved music. And I just remember thinking, there's a lot of ways I can do that. There's a lot of other things I love that have those same components. And so that was kind of how I ended up in politics.
Yeah, and a lot of folks don't really realize how cutthroat the music industry is. I mean, behind it,
Yeah.
with recuperable funds and most artists being in debt and all that kind of stuff. I mean, it's really cutthroat. We see the
It
sort of
is.
glitzy artists out there with their wardrobes and cars and mansions, but you don't see what they have to endure, and that they're probably still making payments on all of those things.
That's exactly right. And people always laugh and say, you thought the music industry was corrupt and you went into politics. And I'm like, yeah, that's how bad the music industry is. It is worse than politics. It's super political itself. A lot of those people are not making the kind of money you would think they are. And, in recent years with the Me Too things that came out, I kept waiting for it to come for the music industry, and it never quite got there for some reason, but there was a ton of that. And it was, it was a young female who wasn't willing to sleep around to get a deal. That was something that just made it a really terrible work environment and something I didn't really want to position myself in. So there were just a lot of downsides. And as a creative person, the control that artists have over their creativity, over their music, over anything to do with that aspect is so limited. It's so commercialized. There's really little of that process, and so I think if I were to give advice to people nowadays who wanted to go into being an artist, I would say go the independent route. You don't need to go get a label at this point. With how everything's been democratized, you can take it straight to the people and build up a fan base and probably make as much money as some of those people with deals at the end of the day.
Absolutely. Well, I'm happy you did get into politics because a lot of your insights are very refreshing, and they are. And the reason you said you're a libertarian conservative is in part, and it's my personal opinion, I'm just ruminating here, so please correct me if I'm wrong. A lot of your viewpoints are hard to categorize neatly into the modern partisan parlance. For example, I was reading a piece you wrote in The Hill, and you, I mean, as a libertarian conservative right-leaning person, mentioned how you believed in systemic racism, which interested me because a lot of them, I mean, myself included, don't really, if we don't believe in it, we just don't really put as much stock in it as a lot of people. So what brought you to that revelation in particular, and have you gotten any response from a lot of conservative or libertarian followers that you have who have said, okay, this has gone too far for me, or has mostly just been mixed?
I would say it's mixed. I think writing about systemic racism is certainly the issue I get the most hatred for. There's a lot of people who don't want you to discuss that. There are a lot of people that want to shut that down. And there's a lot of people that are sort of gatekeeping and trying to say this isn't conservative, this isn't libertarian. But I find that those people are smaller in number and just very loud. They're very confrontational and they're usually very mean online. But I actually get overwhelming support from it as well, from people who say, especially people, who are on the left, who say, I don't like where the left is going. I'm not a socialist. I don't agree with them economically, but I've always been hesitant to get involved with libertarian conservatism because I think some of the people are racist or they don't care about racism. And that's, a really big issue to me. You're the first person I've seen talking about this. And I think we do see a growing, awakening in libertarian and conservative circles for people that are starting to say, hang on, there's something wrong here, right? And it's okay for us to talk about this. In fact, we should be talking about this. If you truly believe in individual liberty and limited government, you have to be concerned if our government is disproportionately hurting people of color with its policies. Now, bad policies hurt everyone. I'm not going to argue that. But certainly we do see in aspects, especially things like the criminal justice system, but I would even extend that to things like our public school system, that really bad policies hurt everyone, but they end up having a disproportionate effect on people of color. That wasn't something I always held to be true. I was somebody who, grew up in my own bubble, like most of us do. I was pretty far removed from anybody who had been impacted by the criminal justice system. I didn't go to public school until the last couple of years of high school, so I didn't really know many people in that system. And it wasn't until really post-college when I started doing some pro bono work with the National Alliance on Mental Illness, and also working in the music industry, that I started running into people who had had these experiences, who had been impacted by these policies. And really, it made me do what I hadn't done up until that point, which was really turn to the data and really research it and stick extensively and say, hold on a second, what's going on here? Let me look into this more in depth. And it's irrefutable that the data backs that up. So it's something that I think we need to lead on. We need to talk about more, but I'm not going to lie and say it's been an easy thing to do. It certainly puts you front and center for a lot of hatred.
Oh, certainly. And look, I don't, and let me just make this very clear to any of my listeners. I don't believe in gatekeeping. I don't believe in purity tests. I don't believe in any of that kind of stuff. If someone in the very depths of their heart has a desire to ensure that non-aggression is a sort of standard of their moral and ethical beliefs and how they want the government to be run, I don't care if they're a Elmo, I don't care if they're Barney, I don't care what they look like or what they believe, they should be accepted into the libertarian and conservative tent. Period. even if we do differ, because I myself, I'm skeptical of a lot of the, systemic racism claims, but I can see how a libertarian conservative or anyone can be compelled by the data, because the data does show a sort of disparity between African Americans and white people in some respects and some how they're treated and everything. I can see how someone can be compelled to that, but apparently being compelled by evidence to some people means that you are a sort of a left winger, and to some people on the left, being compelled by evidence of like gender differences or sex differences means you're a right winging misogynist or whatever they want to say about you. So I find the echo chamber quite disturbing, and the fact that you face it yourself is quite telling as well.
Yeah, I appreciate you saying that, and I totally agree. I often say I don't really care where somebody's coming from, if they're a left-leaning libertarian, if they're a right-leaning libertarian. I don't even think those terms make sense, because libertarian isn't this theory that's in the middle. It's its own theory that's separate from the other two, but that's how it gets framed. I don't care if people think the best route is working in the GOP or working in the LP or even working in the DNC, as long as you're pushing for free market policies, individual liberty, and limited government consistently, I can work with you. And on top of that, even if you're not somebody who's working on those things consistently, I can probably find an issue to work with you on. And that's really key, because I get a lot of bills passed in this country, and I don't do it by gatekeeping, by nitpicking who I'm working with anyone to do right and no one to do wrong. I think more of us need to have that attitude and focus on the real enemy, which is the government and its policies, and removing these things that hurt people. That needs to be what we keep our sights on.
Absolutely. And so tell me, what policies have you gotten passed, or what bills have you gotten passed recently?
Well, like I said, for the past 2.5 years, I've been leading conservatives concerned about the death penalty. So my work has been really singularly focused on death penalty repeal. Most of our work is really focused not so much on passing the bill itself, but we lay the groundwork to basically get everything set up to have the foundation to where conservatives then want to pass these bills. And so a lot of what we do is speaking, using the media to educate people, building coalitions, organizing, finding stakeholders in the communities, whether that be murder victims' family members, faith leaders, former members of corrections, law enforcement, attorneys, anybody who's really been up close and personal with this issue, we seek to really bring into the fold. And we do a lot of work that comes before the actual passage of the bill, but we have been successful in passing legislation in 2 states over the past 2 years. So we overturned it in New Hampshire last year, and in Colorado this year, just before the COVID shutdowns hit, which was pretty miraculous. And in each of those instances, we've done it with significant Republican support, which has been really exciting. I feel pretty confident that we'll pass it in Wyoming next year. There's some questions about whether or not their session's going to get delayed due to COVID. They're looking at potentially moving it to the spring, which I think might be something we see out of several states. We're waiting to find out exactly how they're all going to handle this. We're seeing a lot of traction in Ohio. I think that's a state we'll succeed in the next year or two. So there's significant momentum building. Before I took over this job that I currently have, I was the director of outreach for the Beacon Center of Tennessee, which is a free market think tank. And we worked on a wide range of policies, school choice, occupational licensing reform, criminal justice reform as well, ending corporate welfare. We did tax reform. Anything that was under the free market kind of bucket, we were typically involved with. And then we also had a pro bono litigation department where we would actually sue either the city or the state for bad laws that infringed on people's constitutional liberties. So we did a lot of property rights issues under that. We did some freedom to work. Nashville, for one example, had a ban on home businesses that we sued over. And so a lot of those things were successful. We overturned a hair braider's license in the state. We overturned a horse massage, if you can believe it, license in the state. We helped stand up for Airbnb owners who the city was trying to put out of business. And we're successful in that. We did overturn the home business ban. We did pass a law that ended the last remaining income tax in Tennessee, making the state income tax free, which was really cool. We passed a lot of reentry and workforce development type legislation with criminal justice reform. So there was a lot of stuff going on when I was there too, and it was cool to get to have a hand in so many different issues.
My Lord, you've been fighting all kinds of monsters that have arisen in American legal systems across the country. I mean, yeah, I mean, all kind of things, and that's just and this. I have a few questions actually, but let me get to the more fundamental one about the death penalty. So, as I'm sure you know, I don't have to tell you this. A lot of people, a lot of conservatives, um, support the death penalty, primarily because conservatism tends to be an adherence to tradition and to the good of society. And
Hmm.
the argument most often advanced in favor of the death penalty is that whoever this person is who did an action that rises to the degree of severity the death penalty would be needed in is a menace to society. So it's a sort of public good argument. What do you make of that argument? Because of course there are also conservatives that are much more religious, typically Christians, who are like the government has no dominion over life in the sense that it cannot take it, which is an argument that I sympathize with heavily. I think that I'm anti-death penalty as well, just for all intents and purposes. But what do you think about the argument that these people are menaces to society and therefore we have to exterminate them?
Yeah, well, like many conservatives, I used to be pro-death penalty. I was staunchly pro-death penalty, and I am also a Southern Baptist minister's daughter, which is a strain of Christianity that is also very pro-death penalty. And so, on both religious and political fronts, I supported it. But like many people, I was dead wrong. I hadn't done my research. I didn't know the very basics of how it operated, and so, the example you just gave is one I would hear a lot of the time, but it assumes a couple of things, right? It assumes that the people who get the death penalty are somehow inherently more violent, more dangerous, a worse offender than others, which actually doesn't bear out if you start digging into it. The number one determinant of who gets the death penalty has nothing at all to do with the heinousness of the crime. It actually depends on three factors. The first being the county where it's committed. 2% of counties in this country bring almost the vast majority of the cases that we see. To date, since reinstatement, which was in 1977, every execution has come from 16% of counties or less. So it's a very small number of states. If you dig into state data, you could find somebody on death row for a certain type of crime, and you might find somebody who got life or maybe didn't even get that harsh of a sentence for the exact same type of crime, just a county over. So that's really the driver. The second determinant is the socioeconomic status of the defendant. The vast majority of people who can afford a private attorney simply do not get the death penalty because they have attorneys that can give their cases the time and adequate attention to really fight back. And the third determinant is the race of the victim. We see a lot of racial bias in the death penalty, somewhat within who gets it in the defendant population, but more so around the race of the victims. We see that it is almost unilaterally applied for white victims. You very rarely see them take on the cost and the expense to pursue the death penalty for victims who are Black or victims who are Hispanic. The number one combination for people on death row is a case with a Black defendant and a white victim. So that's mostly who gets it and how we determine that. So it's a very arbitrarily decided system. That was true throughout its history. That's actually why it was banned by the US Supreme Court in 1973. It was banned not because it was cruel, but because it was so randomly and arbitrarily applied. The Supreme Court found that it violated the cruel and unusual component of the Eighth Amendment. They said it was as random as being struck by lightning. And so it was banned. States then went in and tried to fix their statutes for 3 or 4 years, brought it back, but that was in 1977. So we have, almost 5 decades worth of data showing that it operates in the exact same manner. So that's a problem. But there's so many problems with the death penalty that we could start anywhere, right? Like another huge problem is that there's so much innocence in the system, and for people who believe in limited government, we know that government is prone to error, to corruption, to inequality. Even when it's well-intentioned, it messes up all the time. And the justice system should not get a pass because it is just as flawed as any other government program. We've had one person exonerated from death row for every 9 executions. Now, exoneration is kind of a legal term, so I'm just going to humor me. I'm going to explain it a little bit more in depth for listeners who might not be familiar. But exoneration is a step in the legal process where you could have your trial overturned. You could have it reversed. You might take an Alford plea, which is something where you aren't fully exonerated, but the state agrees it shouldn't re-prosecute you. They don't have enough evidence and you get out. There's a lot of ways that you could be released over potential innocence. That's not who we're talking about here. There's been hundreds of those people released from death row as well. Exoneration is another step. It's basically another like procedure in the judicial system where you have to be able to show that you did not commit this crime. So you're showing that someone else confessed, that there's DNA evidence excluding you, that that there was some kind of concrete evidence that you were wrongfully convicted. And one person has been exonerated for every 9 executions. So we know we execute innocent people in this country all the time with those numbers. And the last big issue with it I see is that it's really, really expensive. It's the most expensive part of our justice system on a per offender basis. Costs at least $1 million more than a life in prison without parole case. It's not because it takes too long to carry it out. Most of those costs are incurred at the trial level alone. And we spend all that money, millions of dollars, and we don't get a deterrent effect for it. We know that it doesn't prevent crime. So that's a huge opportunity cost. That's money that we're not spending on preventing violence in the first place, which should be the goal. And it's money we're not spending on solving more cases, which we still do very little of. The clearance rate for homicides in this country is only a 60% average.
Wow. Wow. 60% average.
60%, and that's the average. So, if you dig into the data, that some counties doing 0%, 30%. If you kill somebody in this country, we always say that the actual deterrent to crime is the assurance that you will be caught. And if you look at the data in this country for clearance rates, you've got a really good shot not being caught in this country because we waste so much money trying to look like we're doing something instead of actually working on programs that would be effective.
And have you found, since you've done work with reentry programs, so on and so forth, have you found that a more community policing based model has actually been more of a good deterrent and for crime? Have you found certain types of crime? Have you found that?
Yeah, I've been studying that more and more in depth. I really think there's some fascinating things happening. Newark is a really great example that has implemented a lot of these community-based policing programs. I really like the cure violence model that we've seen come out of Baltimore and expand through several of the major cities across this country. I'm just trying to learn as much as I can about it. But the things that I enjoy about that model are it backs up what I believe, right, on principle. These are limited government models. They're cheaper. They're using public-private partnerships. So you've got the free market actually managing things, which I think will always go better than the government managing things.
100%.
They're local. You've got community control. And it gets back to the root of, we ask police to do too much in this country. They cannot be all things to all people. We have to start involving other specialists, people who have training. I got into this work initially, like I mentioned, because I was doing some pro bono work. The pro bono work I was doing was for the National Alliance on Mental Illness. I'm very passionate about mental health issues in this country. And there's so much overlap between mental health and the criminal justice system. And when we look at what we're doing, we're asking police to act like mental health providers and to act like social workers and to also be able to de-escalate and do violence prevention and solve crimes. That's too much. They can't do it all. And so I think these models make a lot of sense.
Yeah, so so let's pivot over to that because I have a few more questions about the death penalty thing because I think that there's also, and I'm sure we'd agree on this, there's a compelling moral problem to the death penalty as well, a compelling moral problem that kind of violates a mutual respect for, a understanding of the individual's value, the sort of sanctity of life. There's a lot of, conservative leaning people like to talk about. There's a big moral problem, but as it relates to what you've just mentioned, though, just moving into that a little bit, a lot of jurisdictions around the country, in the wake of the unrest that happened over this summer with George Floyd and so on and so forth, other people like that, have began moves to defund the police. Now, I'm not entirely sure if a single one of them actually have done it. I mean, I know in LA there was a cut, like a 1% or 2% cut of the LAPD stuff, but that's not big enough. I mean, that's not negligible really compared to the money the LAPD gets. But there's been a lot of jurisdictions in like Minneapolis and all across the nation, mostly progressive jurisdictions, who have said, police officers don't need to be at the forefront of most issues. We need to have mental health workers, social workers, and so on and so forth respond to potentially violent situations. Do you think that there is a role for the police to be involved in certain situations that may not be within their specialty, but perhaps in a less involved way? So like, for example, let's say you have a mentally ill person who has a weapon and is terrorizing a family. It would probably be unwise to send a mental health worker unarmed to situation, perhaps you could send a police officer with them and have the mental health worker try to talk that person down while the police officer just supervises. So do you see what I'm saying? Do you think that there's a sort of
Yeah.
logic and a rhythm to this kind of stuff?
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think police are an essential form of government. I'm not somebody who thinks we can get rid of them or that we should get rid of them. I think that's constitutional that we do have a police force. I think, one major thing we need to do is look at how many laws we're asking them to enforce, right? I mean, a part of the problem is that we're asking them to enforce and giving them violent means to enforce nonviolent, victimless crimes. That's a huge driver. That's a real big problem. I do think that when we have violence happening, when there are situations where somebody is a real and pressing danger, that police involvement absolutely makes sense. I think that mental health providers should be on the front lines when you're dealing with someone with mental illness, because they have de-escalation tactics. And I think we have to be careful when we talk about mental health, because so often people think when we say someone's in duress, they picture somebody with a gun, right? Or somebody with a knife. And not to say that doesn't happen, that is some of the time. But the reality is a lot of the times when people are in the throes of psychosis or in a mental health duress call, they are not necessarily wielding a weapon, but they are uncontrollable. And they need someone who can be a calming presence and de-escalate the situation and really talk them out of their throes of their psychosis. So if you bring in a cop with a gun, that does the opposite, right? That can really heighten things and exasperate them and make them fearful and then have them react. And so there's a lot of things to be considered, but certainly I think it would make sense to have a police person on the property if you were dealing with that kind of instance. And I think the defund the police slogan was brought up by grassroots people largely. These aren't people that are actually pushing policies or that are very involved in the political process. And I think it was a sloppy slogan. But I think, to that end, we do need to evaluate where police should be, what duties they should be carrying out. And again, I think their main focus really should be on solving more crimes. And I think we need to do a lot more with other entities to prevent crime, because we know what drives criminality, right? People don't become violent overnight. Typically, people who end up committing crimes were first victims themselves. We can look and see trauma informed, trauma backgrounds, and then we can see through the ACE measurement test indicators.
Yeah, quick break.
Oh, okay.
1 second. Yeah, 1 second. 1 second. All right. Sorry about that, everyone. We are back. Segment 2 of the Pensive Politics program on the Fed by Ribbons Radio Network and on our other platforms. We're with Hannah Cox, a very interesting, very insightful analyst for the issue of the death penalty and many other things. Libertarian-Conservative writer and thinker, I would probably say, because it's some brilliant stuff, some brilliant thoughts. All right, Hannah, we were talking about the police and, it's sort of expanding what they do in the last segment, or no, not expanding what they do, limiting what they do and expanding the role of other services in their place. And so I must ask you, because you mentioned criminality and so on and so a lot of people, many progressives would say that, criminality, and one of the causes of criminality is poverty, and therefore a solution to that would be welfare programs and things of that sort. And there has been some correlation between giving people money and their impoverished state going down. Obviously, if you give someone money, they won't be technically considered poor if you give them enough money. But long term, we understand the war on poverty and things of that sort are not really effective in alleviating poverty overall. But do you think that there is some logic to trying to, have anti-poverty programs instituted to perhaps thwart the effects or the possibility of criminality? Or is there a different method in which we must pursue?
Yeah, I continue to think the main driver of criminality is trauma. And so I think we need to be doing a lot more early intervention and measurements to ensure that we're catching people before the cycle repeats
not
itself.
Poverty.
Yeah. But I do think poverty is a driver, right? It's not trauma isn't the only driver. I think it's the main culprit, but certainly poverty is a factor. And I think that there are things we should be doing. I don't think that we end poverty by permanently funding poverty. I think that we need to be looking at ways out of poverty for people. That would look like school choice. That would look like helping kids who are stuck in failing schools and cycles of poverty break out and have an option to get a good education. That would look like occupational licensing reform, removing government barriers that prevent people from accessing a good job, from opening their own business. We need to reduce business taxes. We need to make it easier for people to succeed. Right now, we have ham-tied our economy so drastically and our workers that it's very difficult to get ahead. You have a lot of people, in my socioeconomic bracket, who paid a lot of money for school, paid tens of thousands of dollars at times to get a degree, to go to higher education, and they come out and they still can't get a job that would adequately pay them, that would help them pay back their loans, that would help them be able to save for a house. That hurts our economy. That hurts other businesses. We've got to really take a look at what we're doing in many aspects, because it is hurting everybody. And certainly the people most impacted by that are people who are lower on the socioeconomic scale. And so I don't think it's something that we should ignore, but I think we have to lead on that. So often conservatives and libertarians want to be the no guys, and that's fine. There's a lot of bad ideas on the left. We should be the no guys, but then you've got to come up with other alternate solutions yourself and really do something about it. And that's where I think a lot of people in my camp have been really negligent.
I agree. It is not enough simply to say no interference. That's the good principle. That's the bedrock of our beliefs. But you have to actually pose a solution, a community-based social solution, or else you're just going to have government bad ideas come in and fill the vacuum. That's what happens when you don't have alternatives. That's what happens when you have a market of ideas, but you don't have good products on one side.
Mm-hmm.
But so you made a very interesting point about trauma being the main driver of poverty and not main driver of criminality and not poverty, excuse me. And so my question to that is, because I've never really heard that before, because it's presumed, and this is what we were taught in public school, this is what a lot of think tanks even push, that if you fix poverty, you fix the cause of crime. But of course, and as you know, crime is more than just property crime, much of which is committed
Right.
by people who are typically impoverished, if I'm correct. I could be wrong. So
Yeah.
Would you say that understanding different types of crime is probably more useful than just saying, poverty is the cause of crime, as is so wont to do by the intelligentsia?
Right. Yeah. There's a lot of drivers of crime. Now, again, I think, trauma and poverty are really overlapping, right? Because there is a lot of trauma that people in poverty incur by nature of the fact that they're living in poverty and the things they confront and deal with, right? Like if you grow up in an impoverished neighborhood in an inner city and there's gang violence around you and there's gunshots all the time, like, and people who sell drugs and like you're constantly seeing police brutality, like that is trauma. So there's gonna be a lot of things that run in and overlap each other. Certainly addiction is something, that drives criminality. That's another overlap where we don't usually see someone start, using drugs without trauma first being the gateway. And so I think that there's a lot of things that intertwine. Certainly when it comes to poverty, we do see, that be a driver of petty crimes, of financial type crimes. And then what we typically see happen is that person starts encountering the justice system. And then that starts building barriers for them that make it harder for them to come back and get on the right path, and they also typically are meeting new people to do crimes with. They're learning how to get away with crimes better. And so we have this escalation problem. So that's first and foremost. But I think if you look at violent crime, and I think so often we focus on the nonviolent system, and for good reason. We need to eradicate these laws. We need to get these people out of jail. But the reality is a lot of people in our jails are violent criminals, and they did do something wrong, and they weren't wrongfully convicted. We have to start grappling with that. And what do we do about those people? And what do we do to rehabilitate him? And what do we do to make sure other people don't repeat this pattern if we want to deal with mass incarceration? That's the reality. And so often in our society, that has not been the posture of people. Even people working on criminal justice reform have had a bit of an attitude of throw those people away and, throw away the key. And we don't really care what happens to them. And that's a problem. That's not a pro-life culture if you believe people lose their value as a human being because they've done something wrong. I don't think that is in any way aligned with my belief system politically or ethically or religiously, but I also just don't think it's very wise. People are not disposable. People can be rehabilitated. People can be reached. We need to be following the science and really looking at the whole body of research that has come about in the past 2-3 decades around trauma, around how it changes people's brains, around how it changes their reactions, around how People typically tend to escalate in violence. We don't see someone go out and just commit murder overnight. That's not how crime manifests. That's not how we see violence really begin. Again, typically we see somebody who has grown up in trauma, who has been victimized themselves, who has known victims of crime. Typically they have people in their family who've been victims of crime, and then they start to replicate the patterns that they've grown up around and seen. We have measurements, we have ways of intercepting that, of knowing that, and of starting to intervene, but we're not currently doing it because we waste so much money on all these other things we're doing.
Yes, indeed. Indeed. There's a steep opportunity cost that I think a lot of people are feeling because of that. And so we've done a lot of insider baseball here a little bit, but let's kind of expand out into the more broader political scene. What do you think most people during this very perilous political period that we live in, certainly, are thinking about? What are most voters or most people in general in America thinking about? Because for young folks, the refrain, I'm 20, the refrain for people like us is almost undoubtedly, hey, free speech, college campuses, things of that sort. That what appears to be on our mind 24/7, cancel culture, things of that sort. But after a while, those lines get tired, and I get tired of hearing about those things, even though they are certainly real things, I believe. But I get tired of hearing about those things as if that's the only thing I'm supposed to care about as a young Gen Xer. So I want more. I want a more sort of holistic view of things. So what do you think most people are thinking about this election beyond the things that are just shoved into their face and just constantly repeated over and over and over by pundits and other folks who think they have a better idea of what they should be thinking about than they do?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think I have two answers. I think there's two Americas right now. And I mean that in the sense of there are people who are being really economically harmed by the shutdowns. And there are people who are wondering how they're going to make ends meet. There are people who are losing their homes, people who have lost their jobs, people who are losing their businesses that they've poured all of their life savings into. And those people, that's what they're focused on. They're focused on, how am I going to make it through this? How am I going to get up and going? Am I going to make it month to month? How am I going to pay my bills? I met somebody last month out of Nashville's music industry. And she was an audio tech, and she was doing quite well in the music industry, but she worked contract work, and she has been out of work for 6 months. And so have many of her peers and associates in that kind of work. She can't get unemployment because she was on contract work. So she didn't have a W-2. And so her and her friends are having to scrape by. They're having to do Uber Eats. They're having to drive for Uber. They're trying to pick up, jobs here and there wherever they can. These are people that are getting, 6-7 months in. That's a really big deal. Most people don't have savings to cover 6 to 7 months. We know most Americans don't have $1,000 to cover an emergency expense. So for that America, they're really concerned, and we need to really be thinking about what our government's actions are doing to exasperate a pandemic. And I think that there's a lot of blame to go around for how this has been handled in that regard. I think the other half of America are people who are fortunate enough to have jobs where they can work from home, or already were working from home. And so they're not, as severely impacted by this. And I think that's where you see a lot of the issues you mentioned come up. I think a lot of America is really focused on the culture war in this election, and in general, period. People often ask me, why did Trump win? I get asked that all the time from 2016, and they have all these theories. And I always say, no, it was the culture war. Plain and simple. It was the culture war. Most people don't know policy. Most people aren't paying attention to policy. They're not tracking it. He says he's against socialism. They don't know that he pushes socialist policies sometimes, right? They know the talking points, and they know that he's standing up for their beliefs. And so I think that's what it comes down to. I think you see a lot of people that are fighting for the way of life they want to see in this country, and they're fighting over really, kind of in the cloud concepts versus the meat and bones of policy.
And do you see because you are a policy analyst, and you also have like an ethical foundation as well, but do you see a point where sort of being in the clouds and having these concepts in your head and applying these concepts to very real political systems could be negative or sort of detrimental to actually finding out practical solutions to these issues? Because, for example, I am a philosophy student. I read philosophy all day, and I read political philosophy all day. And my political commentary that I do, all of it is based off of philosophy and reason and things of that sort. I don't really do a lot of the statistics or the facts or the figures. I cite them sometimes when they're necessary, but I don't really do a lot of that. Folks have told me, Christian, you're so impractical. Christian, I don't understand. Christian, this. I'm like, okay. well, what I don't know what else to do because our founders were like this. I mean, all the people who influenced the foundation of the American political system had first principles at their disposal before they had stats or figures. I don't know what to do. So, do you have any advice for me? Where am I going wrong here?
Well, I don't think you're doing anything wrong. I think, we have two jobs when we're working in these kind of spaces. And the first is the job that most people don't want to do. It's the reason most Americans are at each other's throats and fighting over things that largely don't matter or shouldn't be political issues in the first place, versus paying attention to the things that do matter and that are real and pressing and that are going to hurt them and impact their lives. We need people who understand the stats and who read the data and who really grasp the policy. But the second thing we need is we need people who can then communicate that information to the people in a way they're going to listen to. And it's a hard fact, I think, for people like me and you to accept that no one wants to listen to our data. Because I think my data is really cool and I want to talk about it all the time. I'm fascinated by data, but I've had to learn that like nobody really wants to hear that for the most part. And so if you want to get people to listen, you've got to be able to repackage it and relate it to them in a way they're going to grab onto and care about. And that's, that's the real goal, I think, of people in politics who want to get something done. Now, there's a lot of people in politics who don't want to get things done. They just want to see their face on TV or be in a position where they get to have nice dinners. But for people who are actually trying to accomplish and move an ideology, that's the plan, right?
Yeah, and so tell me, you mentioned this sort of data thing, in a lot of millennial and Gen X spaces on YouTube and other Twitter and Facebook, all these other kind of things that influence Gen X politics. There is a refrain, a common refrain. I destroyed this person's argument with facts and logic, and it gets a little bit annoying, Hannah. Just being quite honest with you. I mean, it gets a little, especially someone who studies argumentation. The goal of philosophical argumentation is not to destroy anyone. I mean, Plato said disagreement was a sign of ignorance. So the goal is not to destroy that person. It's to get them closer to the truth, or to find out who's right or who's wrong, so that you both can benefit from understanding the truth. But for most people, and even some friends I have, they're like, yeah, Christian, you should destroy that guy. Destroy him. I don't want to destroy anyone, because I want to build something. I want to build a foundation. But as a policy analyst, you work a lot with data and figures. Have you had people pose that idea to you? Come on, destroy this person or destroy that argument. And in general, how do you feel about that kind of trend that's going on right now?
Yeah, I think you're so astute in recognizing the flaws with that. The goal of politics is to convince people to your side, right? It's not to demolish them, to destroy them. I think I even had a tweet a couple of days ago pointing out in response to some libertarian infighting per usual that, I didn't change my mind on a lot of big issues that I've changed my mind on because somebody destroyed me or because somebody shouted at me or talked down to me or made me feel little. I actually usually change my mind because someone did the opposite to me. They trusted me. They confided in me. They expressed surprise that I didn't hold a certain view. They asked if I would read something. They, calmly educated me. And I've changed my mind on some really big issues. When I was younger, I was a little neocon. I wasn't that involved in politics, but I loved war. I thought war was great. Go get them. I mean, I had this very, very opposite stance on a lot of issues that I now have. And I think that that's just really ignorant. But again, I think it goes back to what is driving our political system right now, which is this very hyper partisan, driven by animosity culture war that has so little to do with policy. It has so little to do with ever passing a bill or getting anything done. They just want to feel dominant. They want to destroy the other guy. I don't feel driven by that. I can't stand people who are. I tune them out. I don't think they're very intelligent. So, I mean, that's just a turn off to me in the first place. And then secondarily, I don't find them very informative because typically their facts aren't that good. And even if they do have good facts, they're not that good of communicators. And so what's the point, in listening to these people? I instead love to listen. I love David French. David French is a conservative who's far more right wing than I am.
Absolutely.
But I think he is incredibly intelligent, very well researched. He has a great demeanor. He always approaches every issue with intellectual humility, with kindness to people. That's the kind of person I want to follow and that I'll learn from. I think a real problem we face in this society is that people don't know people different than them. I've been very fortunate that I have always had friends across the political aisle. I've always had friends that came from very different backgrounds than me. And so to me, I can't disparage Democrats as a whole. I have a lot of friends who are Democrats. I have a lot of colleagues who are Democrats. I work with Democrats across this country who I think are great people and who I think share my concerns and want to see people be able to do well in this country. Now, they have different ideas for that sometimes, but what I found is because we have those relationships, I can move them on certain issues and we can work together and we actually get stuff done. That's the attitude that people should have. I really think there's a dangerous drive to push people in the opposite direction. And the reason for that is because it sells. You know, if I wanted to get more clicks, if I wanted more followers, it would be very easy just to talk about hyper partisan talking points and be outraged all the time and give people that feel good feeling of defeating their enemy. That's not what I'm interested in doing, but there's a lot of people, like I said, who are in politics because they want their face blown up and because they want nice dinners versus trying to actually move an ideology.
Yeah, one of the hardest things about being in political media, and me as a novice, I'm beginning to realize this, is that you are expected to tout whatever talking point your side is touting at that point in time. So, for example, if I want to talk about how the individual is being assailed with all this political turmoil in America, that's not very popular. I mean, it's consistent with my principles. It's not very popular right now. They want rather talk about some email server from some vice president's son. I mean, and I don't want to talk about that. I'm sorry. It just doesn't interest me. I mean, God be with that situation. I hope that everything comes, but it just doesn't do much for me. I want to talk about the ideas that gave life, that actually gave a sort of electric birth to the institutions that we have right now. Because I think that if we understand them, we'll be able to consequently work our institutions better to get not only better outcomes, but more just outcomes as well.
Absolutely. I think that's totally true. And I think as a whole, we just haven't had a lot of people doing that in the public square. And one thing, just to encourage you, but that I also find encouraging personally is, I'm not someone who has ever towed a party line in my line of work. I've always been divergent in my viewpoints. I've always applied critical thinking skills to policies, and I decide what I think about policies and about people based off my own experience, my own research, and my own intuition. And what I have found is that there's a real hunger for that. People are desperate for somewhere to go. That's a breath of fresh air, right? Most people aren't hyper partisan in this country. In reality, if you look at most people in this country, they really hate where the two major parties are going because they're increasingly becoming more and more fringe. And so you've got a lot of disenfranchised people in this country who don't feel represented. They don't feel like they have a good place where they can go to just get basic information. They want to be informed. They want to participate in their system as they feel is their duty, and it is, but they can't go anywhere. And I agree with them. I can't turn on cable news because anywhere I go, it's just so extreme and not fact checked. And, and so, you've got to really do a lot of work to be educated. And so I think voices who are independent and who provide that will be in high demand. And hopefully we continue to see the market actually drive towards those voices.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I've seen the move towards the long form conversation, the 5-minute soundbite media fights where the two talking heads are hitting each other. That's going away. A lot of young people are not really gravitating to that, from what I see at least. They're gravitating to more of the 1, 2 hour, 3 hour long discussions with people like Eric Weinstein or Dave Rubin or Jordan Peterson and people like that. I mean, who, themselves have their own idiosyncrasies, so on and so forth. But the point is, I do see very, very encouraging signs that we are moving to a better station in our political conversation. And that is one of my goals, to be at the sort of forefront of that and to hopefully help lead that. So we're about to wrap up in a few minutes, Hannah, but so just tell me though, because you mentioned that you were a neoconservative at one point. That kind of made my eyes perk up because, militarism's a vile thing. So tell me, how'd you go from being, it's one of the worst. I think it is probably one of the worst political concepts. Yeah, it's terrible. Anyway, how have you gone from neoconservative to more libertarian? What discussion happened? What book did you read? What video did you watch? What revelation did you have? What happened with all that?
Well, I think, again, it's important to remember, I wasn't a hyper political person. I was probably more informed on our political system than most people because I was homeschooled and my parents, were very big into voting and being involved. But they were just standard Republican voters. They loved Bush. They loved Romney. They had no qualms with, any of the policies under them. And I, when 9/11 happened, I was in 8th grade. So I was old enough to be aware of what was happening there. It was very scary. I remember being concerned that my brothers might be drafted at some point. And I think some of that shapes your views, right? But also, I think more than anything, I was a very average American in the sense that, like, I was kind of born into this team, and I was with this team, right? Like, I didn't really have good reasons for my policies or my stances. The only thing I think I really had a strong stance on that was good was I was anti-socialism, because I had done a lot of historical research into socialism and into the failures of the economic system. I was also somebody who was really interested in psychology and just picked up quite quickly on the ways socialism works against just basic human nature. And so that was a good instinct I had. But aside from that, I mostly just listened to what my parents said, what Fox News said, what the Republican that was at the helm of the ticket said, and I think that's true of a lot of people in this country on both sides of the aisle. Most people are not like you and I, where they can sit there and talk policy all day long or talk about their ideology or, the real reasons for their stances. They just have a knee-jerk reaction, and they mostly look to other people to tell them what to think. And that was certainly true for me. And it just wasn't that pressing of an issue for me. I was focused on music. I voted, but probably just for president. I didn't pay attention to a lot else. And so when I started to get involved in the political system, I really recognized quite quickly that I hadn't done my research. I didn't know why I believed what I believed. And I hate to be uninformed. It's like my worst nightmare is to look like an idiot, not know what I'm talking about. So I started researching. I was doing some work around Tennessee Republican politics. I didn't like some of the rhetoric I was hearing that was anti-immigrant, that was anti-Muslims, that really felt very big government and just antithetical to my ethical views. And so that really drove me to go and try to figure out what I believed and why. And I was fortunate enough for somebody to give me a copy of The Law by Frédéric Bastiat. And that's a formative book that everybody should read.
Amazing.
And that really opened up the Austrian School of Economics for me. And from there, it was a lot of working around the political system, realizing Republicans didn't usually vote for small government, fiscal conservative policies, even when they said they did, and continuing to try to research different aspects of policy and what their implications have been with people. So I didn't go find libertarianism and say, oh, this is what I am. It was more so I was researching specific policies, and my views on them were in line with libertarianism. And so that's why I kind of still say I'm a libertarian conservative. I don't formulate my views based on parties. I really do look at the issues.
Excellent. Well, Hannah, thank you so much for joining us. You've been a phenomenal talk. I hope to appear on your podcast, your vodcast one day. I'm certain it's going to be awesome. Everyone, you can go check her out at Hannah Cox. Tell people how to reach you, Hannah.
Sure. I'm at Hannah Cox 7 on Twitter. I'm at Hannah Danielle Cox 7 on Facebook. My podcast is going to be called Based, and it's going to be available on my YouTube, on Facebook, on iTunes, and on Spotify. So all those links are on my Twitter, top of the page, at Hannah Cox 7. That's probably the best way to find me.
All right, everyone. Thank you so much for watching, and please stay pensive.